The administrative system of the Sultanate uh, cannot be known comprehensively from any one particular source. One has to glean from the different sources that are available, meaning the works that were written during the time. Of these, we can particularly mention Abul Hasan al Mawardi's Akam us Sultaniya, Nizamuddin Tusi's Siyasatnama, Fakre Mudabbi's Adabul Hab al Wa al Sujjat, and of course our very own Ziauddin Barani's two books, Tariq-e Firoz Shahi and Fatwa-e Jahandari.
Ma'am, was the Sultanate based on religion? Can we call the Sultanate period a theocracy?
It is a very important question. It is, in fact, a moot question whether it was a theocracy. Historians like A.L. Srivastav and others like K.S. Lal, Jadunath Sarkar, they considered that it was a theocracy. It was based on religion. It was based on the Shariat, the Quranic law. But I.H. Qureshi, an exponent of Islamic history, would not consider it as a theocracy. His argument is that in a theocracy, the administration is mainly influenced and carried out by a priestly class. And in Islam, there is no priestly class as such. So the Sultanate could not be called a theocracy. Then the Aligarh historians like Muhammad Habib and others have pointed out the sultans did not depend on religion at all. Alauddin Khalji openly defied and ignored the Shariat. He would say that I have no use of the Shariat because it did not lay any injunctions or instructions about running a government. Whereas Muhammad bin Tughlaq would think that the Sultanate should work upon the good judgment. And that leads us to the nature of the Sultanate, as Iltutmish, who was probably the first Sultan, apart from Kutubuddin Aibak, who laid the foundation, he laid down that the governance would be based on istishan. That's what he called, meaning the good judgment, the better views of the Sultan. And he declared that he would rule not by Shariat, but by what he described as the Jahandari and Zawabit. Jahandari could be described as the good sense, the better judgment, the wise and experienced ideas of the Sultan. And such views of the Sultan could be put into effect by Zawabit, which would be a collection of ordinances, rules, regulations promulgated by the Sultan. Singularly, they were called Zabita. One ordinance or one rule or one regulation was Zabita, and collectively they were called the Zawabit. So Jahandari and Zawabit, these two became the foundation of the Sultanate. And as such, therefore, it could not be called a theocracy. The Sultan was, of course, the head of the system, and he had all powers. He was the chief executive, he was the chief military leader, and also the chief judge in that sense.
Can we then call that the sultans were despot?
Well, apparently it seemed that they were despotic in their attitude. But in all practical senses, they were not exactly despots, because earlier I have told you about istishan. It was a declared, proclaimed ideology that they would be ruling according to their better views and better judgment. And then Iltutmish had laid down that the Sultanate governance would be carried out through Jahandari and Zawabit. And Jahandari could not be despotic if it depended on, as Iltutmish explained, it would depend upon the wise, better judgment of the Sultan, and also based on his prudence. and his sense of moderation. So we find that all the sultans from Iltutmish right down to the time of Ibrahim Lodi, the last sultan of Delhi, we find that the sultans, none of the sultans ruled despotically or in a very, very authoritarian way. I would say most of them, they were enlightened despots. The Sultan, of course, could not rule alone. He had to be assisted by officers who were called Amirs and Maliks. And these Amirs and Maliks headed the different departments. There were 4 main departments, and with the Sultan at the center, and this constituted the central government, if we can call it central administration system. The departments were Diwani Wazirat. The Wazir was the head of the Diwani Wazirat, and he was in charge of all administrative affairs. Then the second department was the Diwan-e-Ars, a very important department. This was the military department, the army department. The third department was Diwan-e-Insha. This department dealt with all kinds of records. Whatever was undertaken in the form of proclamations or ordinances as zabitas were put down into writing. In fact, I'll give you an example. The Fatwa-i Jahandari of Ziauddin Barani recorded all the zabitas of Alauddin Khalji regarding his market control system. And the fourth department was Diwani Rasalat, which dealt with foreign correspondence that were carried out with outside countries. These 4 departments and the Sultan constituted generally, the system of central administration. There were other departments like the one which dealt with finances. Munshif-e-Mamalik was the accountant general. He looked after the finances of the state. An officer called Mustafi, who looked after the accounts keeping. Then there was the department called the Mamalik ul Barid. He was in charge of the department of espionage. The Sultanate had an elaborate system of spies, espionage. There was a very important department. It was called the Madad-e-Mash, which dealt with grants and endowments to religious people, like the ulema, the scholars, the religious leaders, and so on and so forth. And the Sadr-us-Sudar, a very eminent person belonging to the ulema, was to be made the Sadr-us-Sudar. This was the only department where a person not from amongst the Maliks or Amirs, but from among the ulema, from the religious group, who was taken into as an officer and as the head of the department of Madad-e-Mash. And lastly, there was the Department of Justice. This was called Qazarat, Diwani Qazarat. The Department of Justice was divided into 2 parts. Mainly, social offences were dealt according to the rules and laws of the Shariat. And these were carried out by qazis, who were again members of the ulema class. Whereas political offences were looked after by the king, Sultan himself. If there was a rebellion, it was the king to judge. In most cases, the rebel leader was put to death, executed.
Ma'am, what is the relation between the Sultan and the Caliph?
This is again a very interesting question you have asked, I must say. In Islam, earlier, there was no concept of an individual ruler, but the concept developed very realistically, and writers like Nizamuddin Tusi in his Siyasatnama, even Ziauddin Barani or Fakhr Mudabbir in his Adabul Hab wa al-Sujad, and of course in the Akamus Sultaniya, Abul Hasan al-Mawardi, they've all said that sultanate, the concept of sultanate was very necessary for the maintenance of law and order, provided the sultan acknowledged the caliph's power, who was the universal social, political, religious, and cultural leader of all Muslims all over the world. So in Delhi, the sultans, they acknowledged the existence of the sultan. For example, Iltutmish would ask permission from his contemporary caliph, and he was rewarded with a chadar and a darwish, in recognition of his power. Iltutmish felt it necessary that his power in Delhi should be legitimized by the caliph's permission. But since then, the later sultans, they neither sought the permission nor did they ignore vociferously about the existence of the caliph. Balban was quite silent. In fact, Balban went beyond the caliphate. He sought inspiration from the Persian shahs of the pre-Islamic days. Sultans like Alauddin Khalji was quite indifferent to the caliphate. But his son, Kutubuddin Mubarak Shah, otherwise not a very important sultan, yet he was the one who actually openly declared against the caliphate. In his time, Kutubuddin Mubarak said that the Sultanate of Delhi had no relation with the caliphate. One important aspect of the Sultanate regime was the provincial administration. In fact, the provincial administration overlapped with the revenue system, because in the time of Iltutmish, there were only few areas, territories which were conquered, which could be called as provinces. And Iltutmish introduced his maliks and amirs into these territories, calling these as iktas, meaning that he was granting them, allotting them lands and giving them the right to collect revenue from those lands. The term ikta continued, though the amirs and maliks, who were known as iktadas, collecting revenue, they were also known variously as maktis or walis. They continued to administer these territories, but they ceased to collect the revenue. They were responsible for the maintenance of law and order in these regions. So we may perhaps consider these territorial expansion and the distinctive differences like Gujarat in the west or Bangala in the east, Malwa in the middle region, and later on when the southern parts were conquered, Warangal or Dwara Samudra or Devagiri, we can consider them as provinces. The Iktadas were the provincial governors, and the system of administration in the provinces was exactly a kind of copies of what existed in the center. There were divisions within the provinces. We get the terms like parganas or Sheikh, pargana, and then we have the lowest unit called as Dehi. That was the village, the lowest unit. There were several provincial officers in the parganas like the Kanungos, the Amins, and the Shikdar. And lower down in the Dehi, Patwari was the village chief who was responsible for collecting revenue from the villages, responsible for the maintenance of law and order in the Dehi on the village. In the time of the Lodhis, however, we come across a new term instead of the Sheikh or instead of the Ikta. In fact, the term Ikta disappeared, and in its place we come across the term Sarkar. So that was the setup of the provincial administration. One important aspect of the Sultanate administration was, of course, revenue. To start with, there was no organized system of collecting revenue, and Iltutmish had introduced the Iqtadari system. Through his Maliks and Amirs, he tried to collect revenue from the Doab region. The lands that were conquered were divided into two parts: the Khalisa lands or royal lands, which directly belonged to the Sultan, and the Iqta lands, which were given to the Iqtadars, the Maliks who acted as Iqtadars or Maktis or Walis, collecting revenue from their allotted areas. In the Khalisa lands, the Amil was the chief revenue collector. He supervised the collection of revenue in the Khalisa lands. There were four kinds of taxes that were collected. One was ushar. This was a land revenue that was to be collected from the Muslim subjects. Then there was kharaj. This was also a land tax, a land revenue tax collected from amongst the non-Muslim people. Then comes an important part of income. This was war booty or war plunder that was collected. It was divided into two parts. A major section was to be sent to the Sultan, to the Sultan's treasury, and the smaller portion to be distributed amongst the soldiers who had participated in a particular battle or in a particular war. So khams is also an important source of income from the Sultanate. There was zakat. Zakat was a religious tax collected from the Muslim subjects only. And lastly, jizya. Once again, there is a whole lot of controversy about jizya. Jizya was when Muhammad ibn Qasim invaded Sindh in the 8th century. He declared that it would be taken from, as elsewhere, as the Arabs spread out and conquered other lands, they concocted a term called the zimmi meaning the non-Muslim, and jizya was declared as a kind of payment for protection of the zimmis in a Muslim land. Amir Khosrow and others considered it as a non-agrarian tax. It was a poll tax, a special tax. Barani would also consider it as a non-agrarian tax. And lastly, about jizya, we find that it's very interestingly, Brahmins in most cases, with the exception of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, almost all sultans gave a kind of a privileged immunity to the Brahmins who did not have to pay the jizya. And similarly, certain categories like women and children like orphans, they did not have to pay the jizya. And the jizya also varied according to the income of the particular non-Muslim individual. And of course, we have elsewhere discussed Alauddin Khalji's famous revenue system, how he followed Indian traditional method, including the Indians into the revenue system, making good use of their expertise, their knowledge, information. After all, the land belonged to them. Though he enhanced the rate of revenue from 1/4 to one half of the total produce, yet he was the precursor, and his revenue system was later admired and adopted by Shesha. Coming to the army, which was the most important, I would say, because after all, one aspect of the Sultanate regime was definitely, indeed, was military. The army played a very important part. The army was heterogeneous in nature. The Turks, of course, were the most important element, but there were Afghans too, The Afghans started coming quite early from the time of Muhammad Ghori. So they constitute a very important part in the army. There were Persians, there were Abyssinians who started coming from the time of Razia. So it was a heterogeneous body. Indians, Hindus in particular, also formed a very important element in the army. Now, there were two groups. Hindus were appointed as spies, meaning they were foot soldiers. They did not ride on horses. Cavalry, of course, constituted horse soldiers. The Turks were excellent horse soldiers. In fact, historian K.A Nizami had mentioned that the entire Sultanate period was the period of horses. In fact, one important element in the army were the gulams or the Mameluke soldiers, who were the slaves who were bought when little children, when they were only small little boys, and then trained, given elaborate military training. The gulams or the Mamelukes later on would become maliks and amirs, but generally they remained faithful to the sultan, to their respective leaders. And they were very good mounted archers. Why elephant? The question might arise to you, because elephants we always think as kind of a block in a rapid moving, quick moving army. It was not so. Mahmud of Ghazni was the first one to realize the importance of elephants, and just as he took Hindu soldiers to Central Asia, he took elephants as well, because elephants, first of all, they created a kind of sense of awe amongst the people. We have several books we refer to how the elephants created awe among the soldiers of the enemy side. A book called Zafarnama particularly gave reference to that. And elephants were most often used to carry loads as animals of pack, but in some cases they were also used for taking a fort as battering rams. Lastly, the Sultanate administration was influenced by the culture of Persia. The sultans were all Turks. Apart from the Lodis, who were Afghans, all sultans, right from Iltutmish down to Firoz Shah Tughlaq, were all Turks. But they were emphatically and overwhelmingly influenced by the Persian culture. Historian K.A Nizami had, just as he had talked about the importance of horses in this period, he had also talked about the Persian culture. He said this was the time of Persian Renaissance, and the Turks had brought in the Persian culture into this country. Persian was the official language, the court language. Records, documents were all written in the Persian. Inscriptions of the coins were in Persian, and the sultans wore Persian dresses. In fact, Persian dress became the official dress, the court dress. And this Perso-Turkish or Turco-Persian, if we may call it this way, was a very important factor in creating a particular statement in the history of medieval India. This Turco-Persian culture would later on be further enhanced, further refined by the Mughals. And one could say that this was certainly a very rich contribution of the Sultanate period to the history of India.